Dark Clouds of Love, theatrical explorations of speculative love affairs of Kalidas and Shakespeare by Dr. Manisha Patil. Separated by the time and space and standing as the metonyms for the magnificent literary and cultural heritage of two different languages, Kalidas classical Sanskrit and Shakespeare Elizabethan English have fascinated their readers to the point of hypnosis. Apart from their marvelous plots, splendid characterization, and mesmerizing dialogues, what has enchanted the people for centuries is their charming personalities. Although very little authentic biographical information is available about them, instead of deterring, it has fired the public imagination to all sorts of speculations about their personal lives, most dazzling aspect being their personal love stories. Even though there are innumerable myths and legends about their romances, two of them have generated literary masterpieces on their own, namely Ashadh ka ek din, one day in the season of rain, and Shakespeare in Love. Imagining the disappointed love affairs of their heroes, these works nonetheless proclaim the prime role played by the Fair Beloved of Kalidasa and the Dark Lady of Shakespeare in their respective progress as poets. These works also foreground the creative process of interpretation and appropriation of text by their readers. Ashadh ka ek din, one day in the season of rain. In his famous poem Meghdut, Mahakavi Kalidas portrays the love forlorn condition of a yaksha who has separated from his fair beloved as a result of a certain curse. On the first day of Ashadh, he sees a huge black cloud whom he urges to carry his message to his wife at the city of Alka in the Himalayan ranges. In the poem, Kalidas narrates the natural beauty of various places which the cloud will pass by on its way to Alka, and then describes the divine beauty of his wife whom he is supposed to identify and deliver the message. There, in the fane, a beautiful creature stands, the first best work of Creator's hands, whose slender limbs inadequately bear a full-orbed bosom and a weight of care, whose teeth like pearl, whose lips like bimbas show, the fawn-like eyes still tremble as they glow. Meghdut mesmerized people for generations with not only its finest language and superb poetic conceit, but also its sublime emotions. It created the whole new genre of Sandesh Kavya, messenger poems in Sanskrit literature, but no other imitation could rival the grandeur of the original. The secret of its uniqueness was quite simple. One can imitate a master's language and conceits, but how can the intensity of his emotions be captured without experience? This fact generated a number of speculations about Kalidasa's personal experience of separation from his beloved. Some accounts advocated that she was actually his wife and further contemplated the cause of their separation, while others refuted it, wondering about her identity and their frustrated love story. As no authentic information is available about Kalidasa's life, all these stories created their own saga and in turn transformed Kalidas into a legend. The mystery of Kalidasa's life led to the mystification of his genius. One of the legends about Kalidas describes him as an idiot who through treachery was married to an extremely intelligent princess. It was to win her heart that he worshipped goddess Kali for several years and received the boon of becoming a poetic genius. So when he returned to his wife, she asked him the question, Asti Kashit Vag Vishesha? Do you have any quality of speech? And to answer that question, he at extempore composed three Mahakavyas, Kumar Sambhav starting with Asti, Meghadut starting with Kashit, and Raghuvansha starting with Vag. Though aimed at explicating the poetic grandeur of Kalidas, the story is an obvious example of reverse engineering, spin the yarn product of someone's fertile imagination. So, it is not surprising if a new speculation emerged about Kalidas in 1958 in the form of a play, that is Ashadh Ka Ek Din by Mohan Rakesh, which was also made into an award-winning film by Mr. Manikal in 1971. In the play, Kalidas lives an idyllic life in his small Himalayan village, surrounded by nature, immersed in poetry, and in love with Mallika till he is invited as a court poet at Ujjaini by King Vikramaditya. Though Kalidas longs for this opportunity to shoot his fame and fortune, he also has doubts about his ability and desirability of the prospect. So Mallika motivates him to try his fortune and waits for his return. Once in Ujjaini, Kalidas easily achieves success, but forgets modest Mallika and marries a noble woman, Priyangu Manjari. Solitary and broken-hearted, Mallika marries Kalidasa's rival and a lesser poet, Vilom. However, weary of the court life, Kalidas returns to his village to seek his beloved and muse Mallika. He tells her, Whatever I have written has been gathered from this life. The landscape of Kumar Sambhav is this Himalaya, and you are Uma. The Yaksha's torment in Meghdut is my own torment, and you are the Yakshini crushed by longing. In Abhijnana Shakuntalam, it was you whom I saw in the form of Shakuntala. Whenever I tried to write, I reiterated the history of your and my life. But alas, it is too late. Unlike Dushanta's forgetting and abandonment of Shakuntala, Kalidasa's forgetting and abandonment of Mallika and their resultant separation cannot be revoked and their love cannot be realized. What remains is the poetry that captures and sublimates that love. Mallika says, even if I did not remain in your life, you always remained in mine. I never let you wander from my side. You continued to create, and I believed that I too am meaningful, that my life is also productive. What is astounding in Ashadh Ka Ek Din is the depiction of Kalidasa's character. Here, instead of depicting Kalidas with brilliant colors as a genius beyond imagination, Rakesh draws our attention to his human side, his genius and his weakness, his love and his ambition, and finally his success as a poet and his failure as a man. The classical Sanskrit literature and criticism emphasized more on the traditions and conventions. Even though individual authors like Kalidas were valorized as genius, their individuality as such was seldom acknowledged. Kalidas was considered great not because he sublimates his frustrated love in the form of splendid poetry, but because he superbly succeeds in generating various emotions in his audiences through the emotive use of language. Rasa Pariposh, as expounded by the Rasa Siddhanta theory. Kalidas is particularly expert at invoking Shrungar and Karuna Ras. The way he describes the beauty of his heroines and expresses their grief at separation fulfills the conventional expectations and as such carries no unique sensibility. Although there are many speculations about his life and character, the serious criticism dismisses them all as irrelevant. It is assumed that he followed a conventional life without much upheaval. The main critic of Kalidas, Malinath, mostly comments on his choice of words, use of conceits, and invocation of appropriate emotions. Kalidas is heralded as the Kavikula Guru not for the singularity of his experience, but for his remarkable command over language, which transforms the most banal convention into the most excellent expression. As a result, the later poets are expected to follow his footsteps and not to deviate from the conventions. So, when we hear the discussions about singularity and individuality of Kalidas, especially 19th century onwards, their roots go back not to the classical Indian tradition, but to the English Romantic philosophy about the genius, creativity, and originality of authors. It was the Romantics who asserted the individuality of the poet against the conventions of the society. According to Wordsworth, a typical Romantic poet is a solitary figure engaged in a long and elusive quest of an ideal denied by the social constraints, and his poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility of nature. It is free of the artificial rules and conventions and comes as naturally as the leaves to a tree. The flowering of his poetry attests to the blooming of his personality and reflects his own thoughts and feelings. His quest for the unattainable ideal, though doomed to failure, fetches him the eternal glory and immortalizes him. The first generation of English educated Indians was particularly influenced by the Romantic school. Their imbibing of English education by itself symbolized the break from Indian tradition. Yet, their imitation of an alien culture derided their modernity as merely derivative, lacking creativity and originality. Thus, caught between the devil and the deep sea, they turned the most iconographic poet of India, Kalidas, into a proto-romantic figure and thereby redefined the Indian tradition. This displacement helped them to solve the identity crisis. Now, they could be both traditional and modern simultaneously, following the footsteps of Kalidas and still reflecting their own thoughts and feelings. Mohan Rakesh, who belonged to the first generation of post-independence writers and was himself the scholar of Sanskrit, Hindi, and English languages and literatures, was well aware of this process of modernization and appropriation of Kalidas. So when he faced the challenge of rejuvenating the stagnant Hindi theatre, he once again turned towards Kalidas for adaptation. However, instead of translating Kalidas, this time Rakesh created Kalidas, which in turn deconstructed Kalidas. Against the earlier larger-than-life image of Kalidas, who achieves all desirables like name, fame, riches, and love, Rakesh creates an anti-heroic protagonist who fails to realize the true love as he is seduced and frustrated by materialism. Aparna Dharwadkar comments, far more important than the historicity of Kalidasa's life and work is his iconic role in the colonial and post-colonial constructions of Indian literature, culture, civilization and nationhood. well known to Rakesh as a trained reader of Sanskrit and a modern Hindi author and a post-colonial literary modernist. In theatricalizing Kalidas, therefore, Rakesh takes on a body of commentary, scholarship, and criticism and ideological myth-making that spans nearly 2 millennia and encompasses the Indian literary and cultural past from classical to post-colonial times. Shakespeare in Love. Shakespeare, the unrivaled king of Elizabethan theatre from modern perspective, was in fact overshadowed by the splendor of the university wits during his own lifetime. Although he made a fortune by acting and playwriting, his literary abilities were frequently questioned. He himself suffered from the writer's block, and there are debates about the true identity of the author of his plays. There is also a whole body of Shakespearean studies which argues about his sexuality from various angles of Oedipus complex, homosexuality, bisexuality, and sexual promiscuity. Especially, a lot of debate and discussion has taken place about the Dark Lady of his sonnets. The ambivalent attitude of attraction and repulsion that he displays towards her, along with the triangular relation among the poet, the dark lady, and the fair youth, create a play of emotions in the sonnet sequence. As a foil to all the fair beloveds described in various literary works so far, Shakespeare playfully describes her as the dark lady both literally and metaphorically. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she believed with false compare. Sonnet 130. There are many speculations about her real identity, but as usual, nothing specific can be said about it. Taking these cues from the Shakespeare's fragmentary and questionable biography, a brilliant film was produced. Shakespeare in Love, directed by John Madden and written by Mark Norman and Tom Stoppard, which in turn was also adapted to stage in 2014 by Lee Hall. In the film, while writing Romeo and Ethel, the pirate's daughter, Shakespeare encounters both the writer's block and its future breakthrough in the form of Viola, a rich merchant's daughter who auditions for the play as a boy named Thomas Kent. Infatuated by her, Shakespeare begins an affair with her. It is their passionate love-making that spontaneously overflows into his dazzling poetry and thereby transforms a mediocre play into the masterpiece Romeo and Juliet, which in turn succeeds in capturing the true nature of love. Although during Elizabethan period, women were banned from acting on stage, refuting that rule, Shakespeare and Viola do perform the roles of Romeo and Juliet. Yet, in real life, they cannot defy the social conventions, and as Shakespeare is already married and Viola is betrothed to Lord Vexus, they part ways forever. In his next play, Twelfth Night, he imagines her as a castaway disguised as a man after a voyage to a strange land. The USP of the film lies in its self-consciousness, which is reflected in the close-up shots of Shakespeare's hand attempting alternate spellings of his name, alluding to alternate versions of not only his autograph but also his biography. In absence of concrete biographical information about the author of the plays of William Shakespeare, the persona of the author opened up infinite play of constructed realities and performative identities for the future generation of readers. The film personifies the musings of Graham Holderness about author and his creation. What is the relationship between art and the artist's life? Is drama autobiographical? Why are there gaps and inconsistencies in the Shakespeare life story? We need a more self-conscious approach to biography. Biographers will tell you that they just take the documented historical facts and explain them, expound them, flesh them out, fill in the gaps. But actually, what they are doing is turning a documentary narrative into a literary one, converting the bare and sometimes incongruous facts into a coherent and plausible drama. It's much the same as taking a novel and converting it into a screenplay. While writing the screenplay of Shakespeare in Love, Tom Stoppard and Mark Norman profusely used innumerable quotes and references from Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, and All's Well That Ends Well, and ended hinting at the creation of another literary masterpiece, Twelfth Night. They seem to testify the opinion of 19th century German Shakespearean scholar Nicholas Delius that the hero author must not only have written romantic poetry but must also have lived a romantic life, not only have created tragedies on the stage but also have experienced tragedies in his own house, must have loved unhappily like Romeo, and like Hamlet, not have known for a time what to get on with the next. Infusing and diffusing the identities of Shakespeare and Marlowe, whereby Marlowe provides the significant modification in Shakespeare's play during a casual discussion, and Lord Vexus confuses between the two, informing Viola of Marlowe's death as her lover's death. Stoppard and Norman seem to fulfill the general reader's dissatisfaction with Shakespeare's dull and mundane historical records, as rightly pointed out by Christina Nehring in her essay Shakespeare in Love or in Context. We do not like that the man who wrote ravishing scenes of young lovers defying their parents damned his own child for romantic indiscretions. We do not like it that the man who created the wildly witty Falstaff was not himself the life of the party, that he was not even, as his near contemporary John Aubrey said, a company keeper. How much more gratifying for biographer and reader alike if Shakespeare were, well, Marlowe or Thomas Kidd or any of the many other playwrights who swirled around him in 16th and early 17th century London. The lives of these men were full of duels, charges of atheism and espionage, barroom brawls, and breathless tires. Maybe we think we just don't know enough about Shakespeare. But then again, maybe we know little because there is simply little to know. Stoppard and Norman take it upon themselves to expand readers' little knowledge of Shakespeare into a substantial movie using the much knowledge of his literary creations. Thus, their fiction resourcefully employs Shakespeare's fiction to create a fictional biography of author of the plays of William Shakespeare. This continuous oscillation between fact and fiction in the film captures the spirit of postmodern reality. In the words of Norman Holland, even more postmodern is the way that film's reality, the affair, creates the fictional play. But the fictional play is historically real and the seemingly real affair is fictional. Reality is a fiction and a fiction is reality. In being self-conscious about the fictionality of Shakespeare's biography in the film. The filmmakers too created Shakespeare, which in turn deconstructed Shakespeare. Against the earlier legendary image of Shakespeare, who was famed to have written all his works spontaneously, never ever scratching out even a single line, the filmmakers presented him in such a way that we can imagine Shakespeare as a writer who wrote with others and with others around him, who combined writing with acting, theatre management, property dealing, and general trading. We can think of writing more in the modern sense as a collective and collaborative cultural activity, a practical process that Shakespeare, the writer, undoubtedly led but did not accomplish alone. Comparison between Ashadh Ka Ek Din and Shakespeare in Love. In spite of different socio-cultural milieu, there are certain similarities between Ashadh Ka Ek Din and Shakespeare in Love. Both the texts depict their heroes not as the larger-than-life figures, the stature they acquired posthumously and over a long period of time, but as the amateur poets in search of their muse. Both Kalidas and Shakespeare have their moments of doubt and are simultaneously inspired and ensnared by their libidos. Their career as poet-dramatist is entwined with their love affair. The initial inhibition they feel as a poet-dramatist is divested by their initiation as a lover. It is Mallika and Viola respectively who are the catalyst for Kalidas and Shakespeare. Still, both Kalidas and Shakespeare are selfish as lovers as they look up to their beloveds as the muses but fail to acknowledge their human emotions. Shakespeare cheats Viola by hiding the fact that he is already married and seducing her into physical relationship, knowing too well that she is betrothed to Lord Vexus. When Mallika urges Kalidas to go to Ujjaini, she expects that once he becomes the poet laureate, he will send for her and marry her. Instead, after becoming the poet laureate, Kalidas marries Priyangu Manjari. Later on, when he gets frustrated with the material success, he comes back to Mallika as if nothing has changed between them. Thus, both Kalidas and Shakespeare cannot possess their beloveds in reality, and so idealize and immortalize them in their works. Interestingly, just like Rakesh's Kalidas is the product of 19th century English Romantic influence on modern Indian authors, psychobiographical Shakespeare, recreated through innumerable fictional biographies like Shakespeare in Love, also originates in Romantic criticism. In the words of James Lake, scholars who attempt to unveil his personality through external events and through internal textual evidence are not an entirely alien body. The fact that the clan and bardoltry of Moore, Spurgeon and their followers are the culmination of a 19th century romantic tendency begun in Germany by Friedrich Schlegel, developed by S.T. Coleridge and perfected by Edward Dowen in a still famous work, Shakespeare, a critical study of his mind and art. The theory is simple. Shakespeare's life is divided into epochs. For Coleridge, there are 5, varying in emotional degrees. The plays or sonnets were written correspondingly to the emotional epoch the poet happened to be in at the time of composition. These similarities between two diverse cultural texts are the result of the similar responses that two sets of readers, writers, and critics had towards their role models. Mohan Rakesh initially wished to translate Kalidas but was frustrated in his desire. So, When he wrote a play about Kalidas, he successfully overcome his own anxiety of influence by reversing the subject-object relationship between him and Kalidas. Aparna Dharwadkar comments, instead of translating Kalidas, the play fictionalized and theatricalized him, creating the infinitely complex and resonant relationships between classical Sanskrit and modern Hindi, history and fiction, reality and representation, and subject and object. Rakesh himself accepted that while writing the play, he was more concerned about himself as a modern writer rather than Kalidas, and indeed projected his own dilemma on the legendary figure of Kalidas. He wrote, in my opinion, Ashadh Ka Ek Din is not about Kalidas. In the play, I wanted to portray the conflict of today's writer, the writer who is attracted by the benefits offered by the governments or other institutions, and on the other hand is also committed to himself in a way. And for this, I needlessly dragged poor Kalidas into the play. But the play is about the contemporary human being. Likewise, while commenting about Shakespeare in Love, Norman Holland said, you can bet that Tom Stoppard and Mark Norman, when they wrote the film, were thinking about themselves as writers competing with Shakespeare. Apart from Rakesh, Stoppard and Norman, who shaped their artistic responses to Kalidas and Shakespeare into fiction, even literary critics from two diverse sets display similar critical concerns. Just like Graham Holderness' rumination regarding the role of author in Who Was William Shakespeare, Hazari Prasad Dwivedi, in his short essay Mera Kanchnar, contemplates Kalidas Kaun Hai, who is Kalidas. Dwivedi asked this question in the context of comparing two figures, the artist and the Santhal girl. Who is Kalidas? He asked, the one who takes down the conjured flowers on paper or the one who lifts them to the head? The question is about Kalidasa's conception and practice of poetry, as well as about our understanding of Kalidas. These two examples clearly illustrate that in postmodern era, author is no longer the creator but a persona which in turn is created by his or her readers. Furthermore, each reader creates the author in his or her own image. Swani rightly indicates Dwivedi's desire to discover in Kalidasa's work a political consciousness that would satisfy his modern heirs, manifest at once an unmistakable attachment to the work or the name of Kalidas and a desire to recontextualize, reconfigure, or even disavow that work. In the same way, commenting on the vast and diverse body of psychobiography of Shakespeare, Christina Nehring aptly points out a telling case of critics finding the Shakespeare they resemble. Bloom, a famously corpulent drinker and a robust academic rebel, so out of step with his literary colleagues that Yale had to create a one-man department for him, thinks Shakespeare identified with the boisterous, sax-swilling one-man show Falstaff. Greenblatt, a consummate academic insider, a king in his profession, and a man reputed to make no enemies, believes the poet identified with the politic, smooth-talking monarch to be Hal. Thus, though these speculative love affairs of Kalidas and Shakespeare begin as an attempt to find out the inner drama of the men who wrote the literary masterpieces, they end as an exploration of the inner drama of the men who read those literary masterpieces. Ashadh Ka Ek Din and Shakespeare in Love, in turn, provide their audiences an opportunity to introspect and discover their own inner drama through the complex process of projections and introjections of multiple layers of reading. Hence, this transformation of reading a text into the creative process of interpretation and appropriation of text leads to the reversal of roles, turning readers into authors and the historical author into a fiction.